I'll try and cover a little introduction to Elbridge W. Merrill. I'll try to go over what the glass plate negative collection is. And then I'll talk a little bit about what Sitka National Historical Park is doing to preserve this really important collection and how we're trying to provide access to the images in the collection. One last comment before I get going, and that is that there are a lot of images in this presentation. I really tried to pack in as much as I could. Unless I've noted otherwise, the black and white images are all Merrill images, and they all have been recently come back to the park after digitization efforts. And so unless I've noted otherwise, they are from the park's new digital collection of the glass plate negatives. Elbridge Merrill was born in 1870 outside of Boston, Massachusetts. And he began experimenting with photography at a pretty young age. At 25, he was listed in the Danvers directory as a photo printer. Around this time, news of the Klondike Gold Rush was going on that likely lured Merrill westward. And he arrived in Sitka in September of 1898 on a little steamship called the Gertrude. Pictured here rotting away on the beach, a Merrill image. He stayed in Sitka from 1898 until 1929 when he passed away. He was in business fairly short order after arriving in Sitka. So by 1900, he was listed as a photographist in an advertisement in the Alaskan for Sitka. His earliest studio was here in the old Russian trading post. If you're familiar with Sitka, the old Russian trading post was on Lincoln Street, facing what is now Totem Square. And that's Rover, his dog, often featured in his photographs. And what's cool about this is if I zoom in, there on the left side of the building, you see E.W. Merrill above the door frame. So that was his little shop right there on Lincoln Street. Here's a photo from inside his shop where he displayed his photographs for sale. He also printed his photographs to postcards, many of which are floating around in collections today. He also collected and sold, of course, what would have been called then Tlingit curios. And you can see the vast collection of items that he was featuring in his shop for sale. Before I go any further, I just want to touch briefly on what glass plate negatives are. What Merrill used is known, and disclaimer here, I'm not a photographer. I am learning about this process as I go along, so this will be very brief. Merrill used what is known as dry plate technology, and so in this process, he took a piece of glass and he would spread a silver emulsion on it. Then when he placed that plate covered with a light-sensitive silver emulsion into the camera and exposed it to the light through the lens, the image would be captured in the emulsion. So you see it up here. The top image is the glass side of the negative, and then the bottom image is the emulsion side of the negative. You see it has that iridescent quality to it. So when I'm talking about the glass plate negative collection, that is what we have. That is what we're working with. Merrill mostly used 8 inches by 10 inch glass plate negatives, although he also used 5 inches by 7 inches fairly frequently as well. The printing process then involved, after he created the negative by taking the photo, he then would put the negative into a bath back in his studio to actually capture the negative, preserve it, and then he would put the negative up against what was called printing out paper, and again exposing it to light. And the paper had a light-sensitive solution on it as well. So as you put the negative against the printing out paper and expose it to light, the image would be transferred from the negative to the paper in the form of the positive, and that's how we arrived at his prints. And what's interesting about this process is that it allowed him a lot of flexibility in developing the image. So basically every original Merrill print is unique. The breadth of what Merrill took photographic interest in is extensive. His photos include portraits, group shots, special events, industries, native villages, landscapes, and objects, among many other subjects. And what's special about it is that he truly covered much of the life and activities of Sitka during the early 1900s. As Sergey mentioned briefly in his introduction, as he'll speak more to, Merrill is really well known, however, for the manner in which he captured the Tlingit community in his images. Unlike other photographers of the time, Merrill's photographs of the Tlingit did not seek to objectify or show them as an exotic other, but rather portrays them much as he captured other people in his images. And as Sergey mentioned, by several accounts, he was considered a friend of the Tlingit community. He had several cabins around Sitka and was an avid birder and naturalist, and many of his photographs feature natural scenes, which is pretty amazing. If you consider the physical burden of using glass plate negative technology, carrying these heavy plates around, he had no problem scaling to some of the most significant peaks around Sitka to capture his images. And locally, he became known as the father of pictures, and that is in fact inscribed on his tombstone. Barrett Willoughby, in her travel novel Sitka, Portal to Romance, who some of you may be familiar with, we have to take it with a grain of salt, but she does describe an encounter with Merrill, and I just want to read a brief snippet from her encounter because I think it really captures Merrill and what he intended to do with it, or tried to do with his photography. Willoughby writes, "Our talk turned at once to pictures. The artist told us that the summer before he had for 2 weeks waited on the shore of a bay every night before he was able to photograph a certain aspect of the strange twilight hills of June. He said, 'I like to think that my pictures go out in the world, taking the healing spirit of my country to those who need it and to those who understand it.'" So, kind of a romantic quote, but I think it suits him well. So a little bit more about the glass plate negative collection and what we know about where it came from. At the time of Merrill's death, his possessions included 1,500 8x10 glass plate negatives. And it's interesting that only 8x10 glass plate negatives are mentioned because there are negatives of, as I mentioned, many different sizes. So we're not quite sure what the total number of negatives would have been, but in any case, it's a number to go from. So his estate was left to his close friend Elizabeth Barron and her daughter Frances, and it can be assumed that the collection has remained largely in Sitka, although at some point it was split to different people. In 1962, Sitka National Monument Superintendent George Hall helped negotiate the sale of 984, quote, photographic plates and sundry equipment from an Ernest Jacobson to the Sheldon Jackson College. So that is how Sheldon Jackson College acquired this large collection of Merrill's negatives. In 1969, Sitka National Historical Park acquired 203 glass plate negatives from Peter Nielsen of Sitka, and Peter Nielsen was purportedly a friend of Merrill, so perhaps the plates transferred directly from Merrill to Nielsen to the park. In 2007, the Sheldon Jackson College closed, and the question became, where would the Merrill collection go? So to help assist where the collection might go, a group called the Merrill Project was formed in 2014 with the sole purpose of raising the funds to purchase the collection from Sheldon Jackson College and donating the collection to Sitka National Historical Park. So this is my favorite Merrill image to date because it has a kitty in it, so I just thought I would bring it up because I can. So in 2014, about a year ago, it all kicked off. This wonderful group of people created the Merrill Project, Inc., and they had fundraisers, we had presentations, and really in about 6 months, they pulled together $20,000 to purchase the collection for the park. We had over 100 donors who contributed to the project, and you can tell in this picture here, this was one of the events, one of the fundraising events, promotional events we did, and it was standing room only. It really was essential to the local community that this collection that originated in Sitka stay in Sitka. So it's really exciting that that the group pulled it off, raised the money, and a big thank you to the Merrill Project. In May of 2015, the official transfer happened, and Sitka National Historical Park now owns the 956 glass plate negative collection. And I should say that the collection we acquired from Sheldon Jackson College also includes some of his other photographic equipment, including glass plate negative holders and print frames. So, very exciting. There were some very specific terms to the gift to the park, however. So under the terms of the gift, Sitka National Historical Park has committed to these following items: to keep the collection permanently in Sitka, to preserve and archive the collection to professional standards of care, and to making the images available to the public as well as to researchers or whoever else might want them. And finally, digitizing the images at the full level of detail possible from the negatives. So we are working on that. We've been working on it feverishly ever since we knew we were getting the collection. Sitka National Historical Park applied for an NPS Centennial Fund project money, and we received over $100,000 to help care for this collection. So the Centennial funding is a Congress-supported initiative to reward parks for partnership support leading up to the centennial of the National Park Service, which is next year in 2016. And I just want to comment that this project to care for the growing Merrill Collection at Sitka National Historical Park is this region of the National Park Service's premier Centennial Fund project. So in other words, it's a big deal for the Park Service. It's a big deal for this region of the Park Service. So it's really exciting. So this funding to care for the plates is going for these, is helping provide these things. We've purchased additional cabinets and appropriate supplies for rehousing the plates. We've conducted an item-level on-site condition survey of the entire collection. We completed on-site digitization of the entire collection. And we'll be doing completion of essential conservation treatment to broken or damaged plates within the next 6 months. And finally, we've been able to acquire, or not acquire, but I guess bring on additional personnel to assist with the development of the finding aid and preparing the images for display on the web. So I just want to give you a quick overview of we've accomplished a lot of this already, so I just want to bring you through the activity that's been going on in the park with the collection. So here we have in June, right after the transfer, we had a 2-person team on site for 3 weeks. This was a former National Park Service curator, retired curator, and his wife. They came in and cataloged the 900 plus glass plate negatives and rehoused them out of old envelopes and into more appropriate 4-flap enclosures. And so here you see former storage and then what it's looking like now. We've got new cabinets, beautiful new boxes, spaced out, labeled, nice envelopes. Looks beautiful. In September, we had 2 interns. They spent about a week cleaning the glass plate negatives in preparation for digitization. And so that meant taking the glass side of the negative, not the emulsion side, but the glass side of the negative, and gently wiping it with a solution of alcohol and water to get off any fingerprints, dust, dirt, grime, to get a really crystal clear picture when the photography specialist came in to do the digitization. So digitization happened just this month. It's been a whirlwind the last month, but we got it done. If you're familiar with the park, we moved into the wood carving studio to have a large enough space to turn it into a conservation lab, essentially. They blacked out the windows. They set up a copy stand for their camera and monitors. And then you see in this bottom picture, they actually built a chimney around the light table, a custom LED light table they brought up for the occasion to block out any unnecessary light while they're doing the image capture. So over about 10 days, they captured every single image in the collection with the exception of broken ones that they're working with to stabilize and to reconnect digitally. And so they were doing the image capture with a Hasselblad camera, which means that each negative they shot 6 different times, moving it a pixel this way and a pixel that way, 6 different times in order to capture the most detail possible in these negatives. So the end result is an image that's about 12,000 pixels by 16,000 pixels, which is enormous, absolutely enormous, which is how I'm able to zoom in on Cat and E.W. Merrill's workshop, and we look forward to continuing to zoom in and finding all of the beautiful details that Merrill captured in his photography. So also while this team was on site, it was a 3-person team from Chicago Album Works that did this work. They're from Massachusetts, and they did an item level condition survey, so that means identifying any areas of weakness in the plates, any areas that need conservation. Some of the plates had been broken and taped together with just regular tape, which is unfortunate because any sort of adhesive on an artifact is typically bad. But the good side is that it actually helped preserve the plates, so they're not as broken because they weren't bumping around in the envelope. But in any case, they took about 32 plates with them back to Massachusetts to remove that tape, and then they'll send it back to us in fitted sink mats that will hold the broken pieces in place without moving around. So this is probably the most boring slide visually in my presentation, but it really is the most exciting. So what we're doing to provide public access. All of these images we intend to put on the National Park Service Museum Collections website, which is museum.nps.gov. In addition, we are developing a comprehensive finding aid for the negatives, and this will be available on our specific park website. So you'll be able to see the different subject categories of the images and hopefully find what you're looking for. We'll also be working on doing a subject index, a searchable subject index using a software called Portfolio Extensus. At this time, it's going to be an on-site tool only until we can figure out how to get it through our firewalls on the National Park Service websites. But ultimately, we hope it to be, you could type in boat or Russian Bishop's House and have all these tags, all these images that are tagged with these specific subjects come up for you. So it'll be a really useful tool, hopefully in the future. And then we're also working on developing 2 new displays, one in the Visitor Center at Sitka National Historical Park and one in the Russian Bishop's House featuring Merrill's images. So I'm going to wrap it up here, but I want to conclude with the Merrill-Sitka National Historical Park connection. Sitka National Historical Park has had a really long connection to Merrill. And in fact, it goes back to 1906 when Governor Brady returned to Sitka with the poles that he had been collecting from around southeast Alaska, primarily from the Prince of Wales Island. And after exhibiting these poles at the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition and the Lewis and Clark Exhibition, he brought them back to Sitka to display at what was then Indian River Park. So Brady secured the unpaid services of none other than E.W. Merrill to repair the poles and to arrange and raise them at the park. And in 1910, that park became known as Sitka National Monument. Merrill continued to act as caretaker of the poles and is in fact considered to be the park's first custodian. The National Park Service did offer him an official position at the park or of the monument as custodian, but according to correspondence we have in our archives, Merrill never actually filled out the paperwork and sent it back in, so he never was officially the custodian. But nevertheless, he undertook repairs and maintenance of the poles in addition to using the park as a backdrop for many of his portraits. Not only was the totem poles used by Merrill as subjects for his photographs, but he also took photographs of other pieces of Sitka that Sitka National Historical Park considers to be at the heart of what we care for and protect. So 2 examples here, the Quixote frog hat and the multiplying wolf house posts. Both of these sacred items, this a'u, is held in trust by the park for respective plans, and we're so honored to do that. Also, the Russian Bishop's House is featured in many of Merrill's objects, and the Russian Bishop's House was acquired by Sitka National Historical Park in 1972 as part of what we are mandated to care for. So the importance of these photographs to the park is really the documentation that they provide to how things were now over 100 years ago. Merrill's images are integral to how we understand the history of both the natural and the cultural landscapes that we were mandated to protect as Sitka National Historical Park. And as such are of great importance to how we continue to manage the park and these objects into the future. And just one last comment about the significance of this collection and it being at the park is that the park really sees this collection and having these photographs as a bridge to the community, so to speak, much like what the Cyril George group is doing. The value of these images is the who, the what, the where, is featured in all these things that are featured in the images. And for that information, we're really going to be relying on the public. We're going to be relying on the community to help fill in the blanks. And we look forward to making that an ongoing project the park participates in with the public. So just as a final thought, Merrill is really memorialized at the park in a couple of different ways. We have Merrill Rock, and then Merrill Rock in turn is memorialized on our centennial pole. And it just feels really fitting that this largest known collection of glass plate negatives by Merrill is now being safeguarded in a place that he clearly loved and really had such a profound impact on. And I guess I'll conclude by saying I hope that Merrill would feel similarly. So thank you so much.